Welcome to Dwell on These Things, a podcast of Dwell Community Church in Columbus, Ohio, where we're going to take some time each week to discuss good things worth dwelling on, as Paul suggested to the Philippians in chapter 4. I'm your host, Paul Alexander. We're speaking today with Dennis McCallum and Gary Delashmutt, retired senior pastors and original co-founders of Dwell Community Church, to talk with us today on part one of a series about the history of Dwell Community Church. Thanks, guys, for being willing to join today.
Mm-hmm. We're actually not retired. We're redeployed.
Oh, redeployed. Right. Today I'm joined by celebrity guest host Ben Faust. Thanks for giving up your time, Ben. He's an adult sphere leader in Dwell Community Church and a good friend. Glad to have you.
I should have been ready for the opening burn. Didn't have a comeback ready.
If you guys could edit out that'd be good. That response. So lots to get to today. With God forming and working through this church for over a half century, got a lot of content. Wanted to focus today on the very beginning. God's forming of a church and forming of a couple of leaders. So I wanted to start, Dennis, as far as I understand, it's 1969, sitting in jail. How was that?
Well, I had my lifestyle of drugs and dealing had caught up with me, and really the Lord had called a halt. His hand was on me strong in jail, and particularly as I reviewed the pain that I had caused my parents, who were Christians, and how vacuous my life had been for the past couple of years. I could hardly remember any of it. I surrendered. I ran up the white flag and said I was going to live for Christ from that point forward, a vow I didn't keep. But I intended it at least. And really from that time on, and I was miraculously released from jail. I was looking at 5 or 10 years minimum.
Wow.
Because I had possession for sale. God caused me to be released through a man in the probation system who was also a believer. I had a very strict probation agreement where I pled guilty to a lesser charge, and I had a list of 20-some rules, which if I broke any of them, I would be immediately turned over to the Ohio Youth Commission.
Because you were 17. You were a minor. Yeah.
Right.
So you were tried as a minor.
They were going to try me as an adult, and this guy talked him out of it. And so that left me alone on campus, but unless I went to Ohio State and got passing grades, that was one of the conditions. I didn't know how to study. I hadn't studied or bothered to learn anything in living memory, so it was exactly what I needed. I couldn't get a driver's license. I had to live at my parents' house. I had to comply with them. They could basically lift the phone and land me in jail with a single phone call.
And they would have.
Which they had done before.
They probably wouldn't have hesitated. As a result, I started trying to dry out, but continued to sneak some weed here and there, and drink a little bit. But I still had trouble with chemical dependence. And there was really no fellowship for me.
You made this commitment to God in jail. What was the outlet for that when you?
I didn't know. Yeah. That was very confusing. I went to a Bible study at the Student Union and it was quite good, actually, led by a guy named Gordon Walker, and later also by another man named Ray Nethery. However, the group I could not relate to because they were kind of church kids. They were straight people. They weren't of my culture, of the counterculture. And I brought a couple of friends there. They were a hard no on that. So that was part of what led me and my older brother to realize that we needed something that we could bring our friends to that would be more culturally suited to the counterculture at the time.
And Gary, you were your friend got thrown in jail. Were you complicit at all in what he was involved in there?
Yes. I remember coming home. That was my senior year in high school. I came home from school, and my mom met me at the door and threw the Columbus Dispatch in my face and said, looks like your two friends finally hit the big time. Because the headline was, 2 Worthington youths nabbed in pot garden, and then the subtext was, more arrests to follow. So I had not been growing the weed in the pot, but I'd visited.
You helped us smoke it.
I helped you smoke it.
Cultivate.
Yeah. So I was complicit.
And then your buddy gets God in his life.
My parents, sat me down and said, if we ever hear of you being around Dennis or his friend, then you won't drive. I mean, they threatened me. I don't remember all that they threatened me with. So, but I still snuck, and I don't know how many times we saw each other those next 9 months.
Probably half a dozen.
Yeah. And, Dennis, made reference to the fact that he'd come to Christ through this experience. And so it wasn't shocking to me, but it also wasn't that interesting to me because that's just not where I was at that time.
You'd gone to a few things.
Yeah. And, I think significantly, I had heard the gospel. I had heard, about you could be completely forgiven through Christ. I just didn't really feel like I needed to be forgiven at that point. I heard that you could ask Christ into your life. I wasn't interested. But those categories got lodged in my head for when I was ready.
So, Dennis, it sounds like you and your brother are trying to follow God, but the outlets you have, the Bible studies, aren't great for your friends. What do you guys decide?
He got thrown out of Wheaton. And my parents weren't crazy about me and him being together because they knew we were into the drug life together. So they sent him away to Pittsburgh, where he served for 2 months in an inner city young life ministry. One of the things they were doing in that ministry in Pittsburgh, which was pretty active, pretty large, was they had an underground Christian newspaper called Liberation. And these were popping up, the Hollywood Free Press and Right On magazine. They were hippies, artists, that were creating these papers, and they had short articles in them, and they would just hand them out for free. When he came home, he said, we need to do that. And, I was like, okay, but newspapers cost money. Somebody's paying for those guys to put those out. You can't just do that. And he said, well, I met a woman in Mansfield who was an editor at the Sun-Times, and we're going to go up there and meet with her. She's got an artist friend, and we're going to meet with some people and talk about it. So we drove up and met out on this hillside. I think it was 6 or 8 of us. I had this funny feeling. Everybody there seemed so confident that God was going to answer this prayer and that we would have this paper. I was just sitting over there like, totally skeptical. But I didn't want to rain on the parade, so I just shut up. So it was really weird because what ended up happening was we heard about a Christian man that owned a printing press in Columbus, and we went and asked him, told him about our idea of an underground Christian newspaper for the OSU campus. And he thought it was a good idea, but he says, we don't do that type of printing here. I can't help you on that, but I do have a press that we're not using. If you want to borrow it.
Just a random press?
A press. And so it was a multi-lith 1250, which is an immense, 1.5 ton machine with like 100 wheels and gauges on it and stuff. And he had 5 or 6 men drive it out in a truck and muscle it down into a neighbor's basement.
And just gave it to you? Didn't sell it?
Loaned it.
Okay.
They later came and got it back several years later. It was still worth coming to get. But we're down there looking at this crazy thing. I mean, it has so many switches and wheels and stuff. And then our friend, the high school printing guy, comes walking in, and he's like, multi-lift 1250. That's what I learned on.
No way.
Yeah. He just started making adjustments, getting the chemicals spread out and so on. Somebody's parents loaned us enough money to buy a few reams of paper, and we started printing until 5 in the morning. We had, 8,000 copies of our first issue. So I'm down passing them out at Ohio State on High Street, and looked down and remembered that meeting on the Hill and how skeptical I was. And this was only like 3 weeks later. Mm-hmm. I'm standing there with a sheaf of these papers, passing them out. I think it was one of the first times that I completely grasped that God is listening to us, that he will answer prayer. And, tears came to my eyes. I just thought, oh, man. So the paper was called The Fish.
Does it exist today?
Like, are there still copies around?
There's copies, yeah. Mm-hmm. I have a little collection, not complete, but The Fish was printed at later. We got a ministry house, and The Fish was printed there, so that was called the Fish House. And then the group started meeting there, so it was called the Fish House Fellowship.
I can't imagine. I don't know. Culture's different, but I can't imagine that doing anything today, passing out.
It didn't do anything then.
Well, I don't know what it
more
did
for us.
but
We won one guy that we know of.
yeah.
Because we had a thing in there. If you want to talk to somebody, call this number. And my brother led a guy to Christ. He was still walking, leading a group too.
No way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how effective it was, but it was significant because it provided a context for a bunch of us to work together toward advancing
that's what it was.
Christ.
It brought us together with a purpose.
But it brought you guys together in answered prayer, seeing God's real at work here.
Yeah.
And Gary, you were part of that at this point, or?
Well, I think that the first issue come out in spring of 70.
Yeah, you came in a year later.
I came to Christ in May of 70.
And then he was just kind of on the fringe for the first year, but then that following spring in 71 is when you decided to commit.
Yeah, but even in that first year, you guys, I was writing poetry and stuff.
That's right,
And
you
I
wrote
guess
for it,
was able to contribute a couple of poems that I'd written about my own conversion. And so that may have been, one of my first attempts to communicate what I'd come to believe.
Which you're going to quote for us now, right?
No. I wouldn't if I could.
What is it that you came into, Gary? Were you guys meeting, having studies? Was it?
Well,
By that time, yes.
Yeah.
That was, we had gotten a house and we were holding meetings in it.
yeah.
71.
So you got the house in middle of 70, right?
September of 70.
Yeah. So I came to Christ in May of 1970, just before I graduated from high school. But like Dennis said, the first 9 months or so, I didn't really do much with it. There were Bible studies. I went to the Student Union Bible study very occasionally. I went to the meeting that they started at the house on Lane Avenue very occasionally. I don't know. I just feel like I was still very proud. I would go to these Bible studies, and I just remember looking around and for the most part thinking, these people are uncool. All I could see was how they were different than me. I didn't know anything about the Bible, so most of what they were talking about was foreign to me, but I didn't want to ask questions because that would be like admitting you didn't know. So I just spent the first 9 months, just kind of spinning my wheels.
What you were doing there, really, I think, is the heart of what would be good to talk about, because we're, Dwell Community Church is a 50-plus year church based around a non-traditional home Bible study model. Was that common at the time? Was that springing up everywhere, or how did that come about?
People were meeting at home Bible studies at an increased rate. It was pretty unknown. Earlier in the 60s, it started happening. Most of them were Pentecostal. We were a little different in that regard. There were maybe only half a dozen groups that met in homes at Ohio State, and they were all very small.
For those who've never been part of something like that are listening in, describe what these early home Bible study meetings were like? What was going on? What was the structure? If someone from Dwell saw them now, like went back and saw what you guys were doing, would it resemble anything that they were familiar with?
Would be very similar.
Really?
One difference is that our kind of house father cooked a meal for us every week. That was usually stew or spaghetti, something cheap, and people would eat dinner and then adjourn into the living room. And we opened the Bible and read our passage. Usually not really a teacher, but someone was in charge each week and read a paragraph and says, "What do you think that means?" So it was a less teaching, more discussion oriented. But people would share what they thought the passage meant and what it meant to them. Then we would have sharing of a different kind, which you don't see much these days, where people would talk about their needs, something bad that happened to them, something to pray for them about, or something where God had blessed them in some way. And then there was a time of group prayer. Not that
45 minutes, an hour,
Yeah,
same.
yeah.
No pastors, no trained clergy there.
No one knew any more than anyone else. Yeah.
I think the risk with that, you'd think that it'd lead to no handle on the theology or no one to really lead. Was that your experience, or was it? Are you fond of those memories? Did God bless that a lot, or what would you say?
Well, we were also attending these lectures still at Student Union, and they got some good theology there. I think there were some, I remember some theological bloopers being believed. The idea that God needs us as much as we need him. But yeah, that shook out later. Didn't really cause any harm.
Well, it's interesting that even back then, when you look back on it, these meetings like at the Student Union, et cetera, they were more like our current large meetings where there was someone standing up and teaching a passage. It was mainly a teaching with Q&A afterwards. And then there was the home groups that were much smaller and much more interactive and with the group prayer. So I don't know how that pattern got established, but that's what I came into.
Gary, when did you start devoting yourself to all this?
Early spring in 71, so I was most of the way through my freshman year at Ohio State. I went with Dennis on a Sunday night to a Bible study of high school students, and they had invited him to give his testimony to explain how Christ had changed his life. And after that meeting, we went back to his parents' house and just started talking. I had been increasingly dissatisfied with my life. I don't think I was sharing it with anyone, but I just was feeling like I don't know where my life is going. And I think we just stayed up late that night talking, and my memory is that was just one of the things that I shared with him, and it was really helpful for me just to share that. I think I was carrying that around probably for months. And I don't remember, maybe Dennis advised me, maybe he didn't. I don't remember if he did, but that was a kind of a breakthrough moment for me. A few days later, I was at one of these home Bible studies, and it came time to have group prayer. And I remember just feeling like God saying, "You should pray." And, that silent struggle that goes on. But I remember just praying. I don't know even if I was comprehensible, but I remember feeling like something broke deep inside of me when I prayed out loud. Then I just realized I need fellowship. I need to be with believers. I need to be in Bible studies. I need to be with Christian friends. And so all that spring was just kind of a immersion into fellowship and growing. I could sense that I was growing. We would hang out a lot. We'd often end the evening after a Bible study, whatever, in my car, praying together out loud. So
Sounds like discipleship.
it was very informal, but I had a good friend who was further along than I was, and we could do things related to God together. So by the end of that summer, for sure, Dennis had been asked to lead a Bible study on Sunday evenings, and he asked me, could you give me a ride to those meetings? And I just remember we would pray in the car before we went in, and I'd try to be helpful to him during that Bible study and talk to the high school kids there. And I think that was the first, I remember that fall feeling like I have a role here. I can do something. I can, by what I share and how I relate to these folks, I can have an impact for them. That was really when the idea of being a worker crystallized in my mind.
That meeting and most of our meetings were not home churches. They were called bush groups. Started from scratch. Mm-hmm. They didn't anticipate partitioning and planting new groups. They would usually live for about a year or so and then fizzle. And there was no rotation of teachers either. It was one teacher, whoever started the bush group.
Where would these spring from?
They were mostly high school groups. And then a student from another high school would attend and say, well, I'd like to want to have one of these at my high school. So we would ask him how many friends he could get to show up. And a couple of them were already going.
And so there was more than one of these bush groups that would kind of come and go and fizzle. And someone would come up
we had
and start
them
one.
in Arlington, Worthington, Westerville, a couple in northern Columbus, Whetstone.
Meanwhile, the Fish House was still meeting regularly.
That would have been more like, that was kind of home base, similar to what a CT would be now.
And those are college-age people mostly, right?
Yes, but the high schoolers showed up down there too.
So everyone started congregating.
And then they would graduate and become part of the college group.
How do you guys explain the success of that time? I mean, you're getting these studies going, people are starting to come around. Like looking back at lack of training, experience.
I think there was an attractive excitement on the part of the believers about what was going on, a real belief that God was moving. That attracted people. They could sense that. It was a responsive time culturally, I think. There was a lot of movement from the counterculture into the Jesus movement because of the disappointment people felt in the counterculture and how it had all the right critiques but none of the right answers. And when they would try to form a commune or whatever, it would implode. They started realizing that who held for these values of love and of non-materialistic living and of community was Jesus. That's what he taught.
Yeah, so, I think one of the things back then was that among the young people there was a distinction between Jesus and the church. One of the slogans in the Jesus movement that I remember was Jesus, yes, the church, no. So somehow enough people had met Christ, even though they'd had really distasteful church backgrounds, and realized there's an opportunity here to do this a different way. I think that was one of the key themes of the Jesus movement, is that let's get back to the New Testament and see what the church is really like, and we don't have to try to work within the confines of something already existing. We can try to do this. That was a lot of the excitement, and I remember picking up on that pretty early after I started to walk with Christ. As a lot of Bible studies were about Acts. What's the early church like?
And you could follow God without embracing the traditional
Because
stuff.
lots of folks, and of course I was one of them, hated our growing up experiences in church. And so but once the idea of following Christ with other people got outside of that paradigm, that was pretty exciting.
Do you see cultural influence today that's pushing people towards these same things, or has it changed to where a different model is needed?
I don't know. I would say this. I don't think most people saw the Jesus movement coming.
When you're in it?
There were a lot of cultural stresses, the Vietnam War. Things seemed to be falling apart, and the young people were a big part of the problem, and they didn't show any signs of being responsive.
It didn't last that long.
And it didn't last that long,
By
but
the
it came out of
time
nowhere.
people realized they were in it, it was over.
It was over. So who can say what might happen now?
Well, today we are seeing response to evangelism that matches anything we've ever seen, and way beyond. We went several years where we had 2 and 3 people coming to Christ every day, and 4 people and 5 people some days. That beats out anything we had back then. You would rarely see someone come to Christ. It was maybe 1 or 2 a month, not per day. Where I think we're finding it much harder going today is in committing and to actually becoming a disciple. I think people are responsive to the gospel, but only if it doesn't interfere too much with their worldly pursuits.
This is a neat picture of what God was doing. Fish House is growing. The Bush groups in the high school, at the different high school meetings were springing up. And it sounds like during that time, both of you were getting the sense that God was calling you to be a leader. Do you guys remember that transition or that pull to where God was saying, I want you to lead my church?
I had a dealing with God in the spring of 1972 where he called on me for a second decision, an all-in type decision. And I eventually said yes to that. And from that time on, I absolutely knew that my life was going to be about serving God, and I knew I would need to find a way to make money, so I just figured I could. That didn't seem like it would be a problem. That call was so strong. Even when we went out to California and studied for 2 years out there at Christian Associate Seminary, we started a group there called Maranatha, and it grew to 70 or so students. And as our 2 years were growing to a close, we were getting ready to go back to Columbus. They pitched us and said, why don't you just stay here? There's more people here than there is in that group, which is true. And so it was a funny conversation because I couldn't really explain why, but there was no question. We were going back immediately, quickly as possible. Couldn't happen soon enough. I just felt this incredible driving urge to get back here and get to work with the people here. And I knew that they were suffering some too because their main leaders had been gone for 2 years. That might have been part of it, but it was more than that. It was you were being pitched to stay out and go on to Regent for more study, and it was the same thing.
It was a no. I belong back in Columbus.
Yeah. Interesting. The same spring that he gave his life to be a disciple of Christ, that same thing happened to me. That same spring, I remember sitting in his bedroom. He was at class reading Watchman Nee's Normal Christian Life, and got to that chapter, presenting yourself to God, and reading that, and I can see it sitting there after I finished that chapter and realizing I need to do this. I need to give my whole life to Christ, and just giving myself to him then. And it almost immediately, for me, the thing that came to the fore was I want to teach the Word. I mean, I'd had some experience teaching the Bible, but it's like that just became like a passion for me. And along with it then, just the sense of we're called to lead this group, like Dennis described.
Looking back, how would you guys evaluate, early 70s Dennis and Gary as leaders of this thing?
Well, the standard was different. I was remembering that we were talking the other night about a retreat we went to where I met Bev, your wife, and revealed that me and my roommate had done orange sunshine acid the night before and had fled up to the retreat in order to get away from getting caught. That wasn't a common thing.
Did that break parole?
Parole was over, but I remember doing Morning Glory Seeds and we would
Get high occasionally.
take,
But I, like Dennis said, I remember that, it was only occasionally, and there was growing within us, hey, there's this other way to live that, you just began to value more and more. So that kind of cut into some of that temptation. You had a real motivation to have a different kind of life.
Yeah, the more things surged on the spiritual front, the less interest we had in it, in being rascals.
Falling, but modeling, forgetting what lies behind and pressing on, continuing to move forward. I think there's something inspirational about that.
And just replacing it, the sensuality, et cetera, with the joy. A lot of it was, it was hard at times, but there was real joy in doing ministry. I remember realizing this is better. I don't wake up feeling guilty the next morning. There's something clean and sweet about this.
If you think that if you guys back then could have got a glimpse into the future 50 years and see Dwell Community Church as it is now, what do you think your reaction then would have been?
Wow.
I don't know, but I can tell you that definitely never happened. Anything like it. We never envisioned we're going to build this giant church or anything like that. It was always just
What's
one
the next
day
step?
after the other. I don't know that we knew where it was headed.
We had a lot of discussions about the New Testament church and what a biblical church could be like, but no like long-range planning or anything.
You wanted to build something quality in that one home church.
We were focused on quality.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
There was an interest in winning people through the gospel too.
Absolutely. And remember those Bible studies, the Bush groups, they waxed and waned. They went up and they went down. And at least for me, I remember, you wanted the groups to succeed. And I remember showing up to one that I'd been teaching for a number of months, and finally no one came.
Work was done.
The work was done. But, at least what I remember was, even though you cared about what happened to the group and all that, it was like, this is kind of fun to be able to do this.
Yeah.
And I felt bad for the people when they fell away or quit coming, but it was like, overriding it was like, this is great to be able to do this.
If somebody's listening in who's a young, maybe new believer or excited about living a life for God, based on your guys' experience, what advice would you give?
I'd say heed the call, man. If you sense God is calling you to give your life to Him in ministry, whatever that turns out to be, it's going to be different for everyone. But I would say heed the call, man. I mean, I am so thankful that He called me, and I can't imagine what my life would be like today. I mean, many years ago, I kind of lost. You could for a while track and think, well, maybe I'd be doing this or that. No regrets.
Yeah.
No regrets.
It'd be hard for a lot of other people to imagine that too, just the impact He's had through you too,
Yeah, I think for young believers, the answer is yes.
Mm-hmm.
You get offers to get engaged with this ministry or that, to play a role here or there. Just say yes and go out and get a lot of ministry experiences. That's what we did.
Very interesting, very uplifting to hear about God working through you guys and this movement through just a bunch of kids that wanted to follow God. That's a beautiful story. So that concludes part one of our conversation here about the history of Dwell Community Church. I'm grateful for Gary and Dennis, you guys sharing your experiences, and Ben Faust's moral support here today. Thanks to you two for listening in. If you'd like more information on Dwell Community Church, you can check out our website at www.dwellcc.org. And if you enjoyed this discussions and have questions you'd like asked in our next conversation, as we move on beyond the early years with Dennis and Gary and the history of Dwell, then email them to podcast@dwellcc.org. And stay tuned for future episodes by subscribing to this podcast. Until then, press on.